delighted to have you joining us. We have at the moment over 120 participants, and we will have certainly a few more joining us, I'm sure. And we're really grateful to both of our panelists for sharing their insights with all of us today. Before I introduce our panelists today, please just let me remind you of how our webinar will work. We ask you all to keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. We will be hearing first from our panelists. Each of them will share some remarks for about 10 minutes each. And immediately after, we will begin with the Q&A portion. To introduce any questions, we ask you that you type those questions using the chat function. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, it's actually a good idea to type your question as you think of it. You don't have to wait until the end, because we will be addressing those questions in the order that they are presented. So don't wait until the end. And without any further ado, it really is my pleasure to welcome both Professor Ellen Hazelkorn, who is with BH Associates, and the Technology University of Dublin, where she is Professor Emerita, as well as she is a research fellow with us in the Center for International Higher Education. We also welcome Alex Usher, who is president of Higher Education Strategy Associates. So again, we will first be hearing from Ellen and then from Alex. Welcome both, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us in our webinar today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure. So, are you looking for me to start? Okay, right, okay. Hi everyone, and Happy New Year. It's still January, so it's still possible to say that. So, guess I want to start. I mean, the question is quite an interesting one. Are rankings still fit for purpose? So, let me begin by just putting it into some context that the emergence or rise of rankings, particularly global rankings, reflected, I think, the acceleration of globalization at the turn of the century. And I put it like that, it's the last one, it's into the 21st century. They were, it seems to me, a logical response to heightened massification, porous borders, trade in goods and services, mobility of people, what we call talent, alongside the increasing importance of knowledge creation, innovation as the engine of growth, the whole knowledge economy agenda. And universities, especially research-intensive universities, became an indicator of the positioning in a global world, positioning at both a national level and a university level in a global world. Mobile capital, business, people attracted to areas around cities involving universities. Boston is a really good example of that, and the areas surrounding it. In fact, rankings' key success was at one level to expose what I would call almost the insularity of countries and universities, and the fact that they were nation-bound to some extent or perceived, and expose the limitations of self-proclamations about, I'm excellent. There was, when the rankings first came out in 2004, an almost immediate, or there was an immediate reaction. The EU went into nosedive around the politics of it all. Governments everywhere and universities began to use rankings to position or better position themselves. Policies emerged about consolidating funding, excellence initiatives, although the term is actually quite loose, picking winners, restructuring emerging institutions, and so on. Students themselves, particularly high achievers, used rankings and continue to use rankings, particularly international students, to better position themselves. So rankings arguably have tracked these kinds of changes. And if we look at the period of time between 2004 and where we are now to 2002, we we see some really interesting changes into who appears and the number of countries that appear. I mean, the most interesting, obviously, is China, which had one university in the top 200 in 2004, but by 2020, they had 24 in the top 20. If we look more widely, which seems to me to be the importance of it, is if we look in the top 500, their growth rate, was huge from 16 to 81, an increase of over 400%, which seems to me to almost tell us everything we know about the geopolitical tensions that exist today. The reason I look at the top 500 is to look at a pipeline, and this is really what's important, and the overall decline of the US and Europe. So we've seen a huge transformation in the higher education and scientific knowledge landscape. But today we're facing a different set of challenges. Hyperglobalization creating increasing inequalities, especially but not exclusively within developed countries, and a change in those dynamics worldwide. Technological changes, the fourth industrial revolution, demographic changes and shifts to the labor market, people living longer and working longer, the changing geography of the global talent pool, the rise of nationalism, exceptionalism, populism, and social unrest, people feeling left behind. The US at this time is unfortunately a very good example of how that can be muscled. And we also see the effects of COVID, whether it's based on accelerating existing trends, which I think it is, but also no doubt those effects. So all these challenges are changing that landscape. Interesting Times Higher Ed announced recently it was going to postpone its changes to its methodology until 2023. But so the question is, rather than simply making amendments, is it time to ask, are rankings still fit for purpose? So I want to refer to three different issues. One is about what I call promoting elitism in the era of mass higher education. So as we know, worldwide participation in tertiary education has been increasing at a rate of about 4% a year since 1995. This is reflected in the growing number of universities, which is tracked by the International Association of Universities, from about 12,000 in 1997 to just under 20,000 today. There's about 220 million students currently enrolled and estimated to reach about 660 million by 2040. However, rankings consider only 5% of the world's universities. The top 100 listed in the Shanghai rankings in 2019 represented only 1.4% of the total students worldwide. And in Europe, the top 100 constitute only 4% of the almost 20 million tertiary students. So what's particularly striking about the top 20 is among the US dominated, 11 of them are private, with endowments for Harvard of 36 million in 2016, Princeton 22, Stanford 22, budgets which are more than many, many countries. And particularly, the overwhelming majority of our students don't attend these universities. The second is that issue of measuring excellence. So this is a huge issue. How do we measure it? What's quality and so on? It's an issue that goes to the heart of quality assurance, always a topic of conversation. But rankings purport to measure excellence using a range of indicators, mostly predominantly research and reputation. They measure research through citation and publication counts, relying a lot on the journal impact factor developed by Garfield in '55. But there has been growing concern about the exceptional attention to high impact journals, impact factors distorting research practice, accusations of over and misinterpretation, misconduct, manipulation, and so on. And we've seen increasingly over the last years moves away from looking at impact. The San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, known as DORA, or the Leiden Manifesto, are notable in this regard and recommend not using it. We've seen the Dutch universities and indeed the Chinese and the Dutch funding agencies and the Chinese and others moving away from using citation counts for academic assessment, appointment, and promotion. And more importantly, the recent years have seen big moves to embrace open science. The European Union in its Plan S, which has now been adopted, this is a move towards open science to ensure that research is openly accessible and not blocked by subscription or behind paywalls, has been a growing movement. It's about, and from a public policy point of view, it's about public benefit for publicly funded research. So open science presents a challenge to impact factor and traditional bibliographic methods. Indeed, what's interesting is in fact the consolidation happening at the corporate side. Elsevier, which produces Scopus since 2004, is also one of the largest publishers and a key source of the data used by rankings. And I'll return to this fact later. And the third point is that whole issue of impact and value. Since the global financial crisis, but certainly it was also before, but particularly since then, and now especially with COVID, the role of universities is under increasing scrutiny. To paraphrase Kennedy, it's not what universities do from themselves account, but the overall benefits they bring to their communities and citizens. And so the debate around public value with an emphasis on societal impact engagement is really on the high political agenda, certainly so in the European context, if I frame it like that. Understanding impact, however, is very complex, but it certainly goes beyond what has been the traditional way of measuring research patents or licenses, and now embraces issues around societal impacts, civic engagement, contribution to public discourse, public behavior, sustainable communities, regional development. The EU's big program on smart specialization is a key policy area trying to deal with regional disparities, particularly between urban and rural, magnifying inequalities of opportunity. So jumping onto this bandwagon, the Times Higher Ed launched its impact ranking in 2019, sought to align with the 17 of the UN SDGs. It primarily is a research ranking with universities' self-reported evidence, and then they evaluate this evidence behind closed doors by themselves. It's a wonder how they do that, which makes it actually impossible to compare or indeed to even produce at global scale. And that raises, again, this question, what happens to all this institutional evidence given freely by the institutions? Again, more anon. So our rankings still fit for purpose. The world around us is changing. The issues impacting on and expected of higher education are changing also. Teaching is increasingly recognized as the essential mission, increasing focus on this question of teaching and student outcomes and all kinds of issues around teaching and the outcomes of learning. But rankings don't and can't cover teaching because of the difficulties of measuring and comparing results against countries, institutions, and students. And it's also misplaced that we can measure teaching at scale as distinct from the outcomes of learning. Bibliometric data is easier to capture. The impact data, citation data is available. But this overemphasis on research is a real problem. And it's a problem at a policy level, and it's a policy with regard to other policy agendas. And what it's helping us to understand is this increasing corporate integration between rankings, publishing, and big data. And it also, it seems to me, helps us understand publisher resistance to open science protocols. And it's interesting, we talked about open science on the 20th anniversary of Wikipedia, which is probably one of the ongoing experiments of open science and co-production of knowledge. The overemphasis, and thirdly, the overemphasis on elite universities as a time of growing policy and public concern and deep concern about this phrase, people left behind. The response to the pandemic is interesting because unlike 2008, when neoliberal views about the market and constraints on borrowing dominated, what we now see is significant government public intervention with renewed focus on the social economy. Just think of the huge 1.9 billion or trillion that the Biden government is now coming out with, and in fact the European budget and so on. So are the policy and societal interests still just about the number of universities in the top 20 or the top 100? And are rankings still useful? So and that's where I think that diverges from even where governments are at. So let's think of the question in conclusion in a different way. Rankings have alerted universities to the importance of strategic use of data. Okay, fair enough, we had IR, institutional research offices, in many US universities for quite a while. And it's kind of, I think, kind of brought IR out of the closet and into the boardroom. But once universities realize that being excellent requires more than just simply climbing the rankings, in other words, what are the costs of it in more ways than one, they realize that having a strategy requires a much wider and deeper understanding of data, and particularly open data, which is more and more available, and requires a more complex self-assessment and benchmarking process. And hopefully that this will see them develop an approach which answers questions specific to their own missions and public values, rather than trying to ape institutions that are not appropriate in the rankings. And it seems to me that this is also a lesson for government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for those considerations. Alex, we look forward to hearing from you. Just as a reminder, this is a very good opportunity to begin typing your questions in the chat.
Thank you very much. I was just on Twitter before I came on here, and I said everyone should come and visit because they could see Ellen and I violently agree with each other. I think she's stolen almost everything I was going to say. I will put the story, but I put the story together in a slightly different way than Ellen does. And I think that leads me to answer the question just a little bit differently. Are rankings still fit for the purpose they were invented for? Yes. The problem is the purposes are changing. And I think this is a much more profound, it results in some really profound thinking about what universities are for. And not all parts of the world are coming to the same conclusion about it. And I think that's really the big issue for me right now in higher education. And I think we're going to see rankings become, in a sense, less global, or at least the way we consume them will be less global, they will be more regional. You know, it's hard to remember now after 4 years less 23 hours of Donald Trump, but when rankings were created in 2003, 2004, there was arguably unanimity around the world that the kind of economy that was produced by the universities in Boston and in the Bay Area were a global standard to be emulated. Okay, it wasn't that long after the dot-com bust, but actually the dot-com bust was pretty shallow and people bounced back quickly and people said, wow, isn't American capitalism great? Right, and so this is just after the Lisbon Agenda. When the Lisbon Agenda comes out in Europe, people are saying, wow, we got to be more entrepreneurial. We need more dot-coms. And the Chinese economy, obviously, I mean, the whole point about investing in universities in China, they've been much more deliberate about it than anybody else, is that the universities agenda is an economic agenda in China. And the 985 process, which started in 1998, that's what the 98 stands for, you know, was about that. And so what you had very briefly for a moment in global higher education was an agreement on the higher purpose of education. And I remember The Economist actually came out with a special issue on higher education. And normally these are cringeworthy because the Economist is terrible on education. But this one, it was almost like Phil wrote it, actually. In fact, I think Phil may have been a significant advisor on this. It was a really good piece. And what that piece concluded was the real role of universities is knowledge production, knowledge dissemination. And they didn't mean knowledge dissemination in the form of teaching students. They meant it in the form of, commercialization or various sort of streams like that. That's the context in which global rankings were created. It was the only context in which global rankings could have been created because research is the only thing you can really measure globally. With some degree of usefulness anyway. I mean, there's lots of other things. You could try to do lots of other things nationally, internationally, but they don't work. A lot of things don't work well across borders, student incomes. And I mean, partly it's because we don't all measure the same things. We don't all measure them the same way, but bibliometrics, holy cow, you've got Elsevier, you've got, the science index. There's all sorts of ways that independent gold standard third parties can do. And you don't need to worry about collecting data for institutions. And that was great. And that's the context in which rankings started. But what I think you've seen happen in the last 5 years, and I think it certainly has accelerated with the pandemic. I think Ellen's right about that for sure. That while that's still seen as the primary purpose of universities in most of East Asia, I would say Europe and North America are moving on. And there, as Ellen said, it is that question is much more about, well, wait a minute, shouldn't we really be prioritizing community impact? And there's lots of different ways. Different universities are going to conceptualize community in a different way. It's not necessarily exactly the community in which you're rooted. It could be something larger, which is national or regional. There's lots of different ways to contribute. But that stuff's really hard to measure. And so I think what's going to happen is that unlike the mid-2000s, where pretty much everyone in the higher education world, maybe Latin America accepted, sort of said, yeah, big research universities, that's the ideal. And you had countries like France saying, let's rip up our higher education system and start merging institutions and creating global superstars. That wouldn't happen today. Like if rankings had never happened, you said your first set of global rankings today, there's no way that would happen because we don't agree that research is the higher purpose the same way. At least it's not the same unanimity around it. So I think, as Ellen said, I think there's also been, and this is probably more global, a useful switch in the way metrics are used, right? Like I think for the first time, one of the positive things about rankings, apart from the fact that it got governments to invest in universities, was that it did alert universities to the power of data. And we are getting to the point where rankings are being used much more as a benchmarking exercise. Each institution sort of looks at its own peers and how they're doing, and they interpret it in a much more nuanced way rather than, oh, well, I'm 26th and you're 27th, right? I mean, I just think we've gotten a lot more sophisticated, but that's a good thing, right? It's a good outcome of rankings. And again, on that issue of like, how do you measure the rest of what universities do? I agree with Ellen that the Times Higher Impact rankings are a really good bellwether, if you want, about where people's minds are about what's worth measuring. I might be even stronger than Ellen about what a hot mess the metrics are within Times Higher, which and I don't want to blame Times Higher for that, because I actually think they've made for the most part a pretty good faith effort to try and measure these things in ways that would be useful for the higher education community. But it's a hot mess, and I mean, because of some of those things, it's just really hard to do because there's a lot of judgment involved. And if there's one thing I wish we could get to in some kind of metrics, or at least metrics related world about higher education, is actually reinserting judgment. I'm a critic of a lot of things that the British government has done especially with the teaching excellence framework. But the teaching excellence framework actually was a way of mixing data and judgment. That was kind of cool. But it gets away from the simplicity. It gets away from the automaticness of it and the scientific nature of rankings, to the extent that you can say that. So again, I just think that not everyone will accept that road, even though there's a lot of people who think it's the right way to go. So I don't want to say that that the rankings are no longer fit for purpose. The purpose was never, I think I disagree a little bit with Ellen on this one, tiny little bit. The criticism that rankings only affect the top 2%, or they're only about the top 4% or 5%, whatever it is, that doesn't hold a lot of weight with me. I mean, I don't think rankings were ever about the other 95%. It was never the purpose. The purpose was to say, where are the big deposits of scientific talent? And most universities actually are not big concentrations of scientific talent. There are lots of good teachers. There's lots of good things they do, but that's not one of them. And I mean, I think what's unfortunate is that higher education is hierarchical. It is elitist. It is very isomorphic. And within the values of academia, there is nothing higher than research. So at a certain level, rankings quantified the prejudices of academia in some fairly significant ways. That's the reason that they were sort of taken as being de facto reliable, reasonable. And anyway, I mean, I'll probably leave it there. So I actually think that if the original purpose, rankings don't do a bad job of what they were intended to do. But I just think we've moved on in terms of in terms of our thinking about the purpose of universities, and metrics have not caught up yet, may never catch up. I don't think it's a bad thing for people like Times to try it. I mean, to some degree, Multirank was trying this 6-7 years ago. I think we should keep trying. I'm not in favor of waiting until you get the perfect measures until you start producing these things. I think it's interesting that people are doing. I think if people should try, and there's some competition to do better. But that's it. I mean, I just think rankings were a product of a certain moment, and maybe that moment's over. But data is always important. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both Alex and Ellen, for your comments. You certainly have sparked quite the conversation. Our chat function has been very busy with different thoughts and ideas. So I'll start with a question that may merit some reaction from either one of you or maybe the two of you. But one of them comes from Flor Cubero, who suggests that it's not only rankings, but also accreditation that also that also produce strategic information, and maybe in the case of accreditation, perhaps more closely aligned with the mission of the institution. Is there something to say about maybe contrasting rankings and accreditation, or is this perhaps the topic for a whole different webinar?
I guess I'd say is that, well, you've got accreditation, quality assurance, self-assessment, rankings. You could argue, as I have at varying times, there are varying different forms of transparency and accountability instruments, if you want to look at it like that. They're all different. They, at varying times, they do, the more qualitative ones, such as accreditation, quality assurance, and so on, at times have that information in the background, but it is the data, I think, that's important. But fundamentally, they're quite different issues. They're trying to look at different types of issues, come up with simple answers on the ranking side, and the accreditation, quality assurance is a much more complex set of issues, and for a different purpose.
Yeah. I think it was Ben Youngblood who said, look, accreditation is the health inspector and rankings is the Michelin guide, right?
Yes.
That's and I think that's, I mean, you can argue about which restaurant guide they actually are, but I think that's a reasonable way of thinking about it. But I agree with Ellen that it's the continued intensive use of data for both purposes, and not just for, I think it's about moving from using this data as summative evidence of something to using it for formative purposes. I mean,
yes.
That's what you want. And as long as we're doing that, that's fine.
Which is why the importance of the data is why I think you see this increasing convergence between publishing data, the big companies, that's where the money's at. They're moving largely, they went into the consultancy, that was a commercial ban, and they're moving now in this consolidation of data. So that to me is where the money's at. And what's always been interesting is that universities have largely willingly given their data for free and then have to buy it back, which is an incredibly interesting model, nothing more so than the current impact data. So, I mean, I did have that discussion. I don't know if Phil here is on the call, but we did have that discussion. Exactly, I would agree absolutely with Alex. Their whole approach on it, 27% of each indicator is about research, and everything else is kind of whatever you're having yourself. But the point is I don't know. I mean, people who know about evaluating research projects and large bits of evidence know what's involved. And you're really wondering, how are they doing this with all this stuff that people have submitted? And the main point is now what you're doing with it behind a paywall. And it's really interesting how universities have given all this stuff free.
Thank you both. The next question is from Judith Eaton, to whom we thank for joining this call. Hi, Judith. The question is to both of you, perhaps either one of you could answer. But now, I think in the current moment, right, where there are significant concerns about equity, equality, and diversity in higher education, particularly in the US, in relation to race, do you anticipate that perhaps race will be a factor examined through rankings in the future beyond what measures of diversity may be already included in some of these rankings?
In global rankings, no, I don't think there's a way to standardize. I mean, racial inequality is a huge deal in the United States. It's not really a big deal in Iceland, for example, right? I mean, it's just, there's some baseline levels of diversity. And of course, you know, diversity means different things in different countries, whether we're talking about income, or we're talking about ethnicity or race or whatever it happens to be, religion in some cases. Nations capture that data differently. You know, France famously, it's really tough to create race-based data in France, even though it's a significant issue. It's been a trouble in Canada for a long time. So, I mean, I think there might be national rankings where you could do that. And in the United States, you already have the Washington monthly rankings, and they're certainly looking at the degree to which student institutions are serving Pell eligible students. There was the work that Raj Chetty and some other people did looking at, you know, student mobility and you know, the top 1% at some of the top colleges. So yeah, it will be part of the discussion. It will be part of, we'll find better ways to do the data. It's not going to be a global issue, because I just don't think that there's a way of indexing. You know, how do you compare what the University of Reykjavik is doing to what you know, Georgetown is doing, or something like that, right? I just think it's really, really difficult to do.
Yeah, I think it's context related. I mean, it's the same as looking at issues. Gender's become a big issue. Also socioeconomic students. It's not just the intake, it's a successful completion. That's important. Again, there's a lot of these factors. The question is how well this information, and that's arguably the problem. I mean, Alex did raise, and I think it was Phil raising the question, the only thing that could be captured is this stuff on research. And that's why they've gone down the research road. And that's why, you know, you could say, in fairness to QS, they then started manufacturing their own data with the reputation surveys, which are hugely problematic. But most of the data in all of them, 100% in obviously Shanghai, and likewise Times, if you look at research and research related data, it's basically all they've got. All these other factors are really very complicated, and that's why even when you look at the research side of it, as you move with open science and these other issues, and move away from using impact factors and citation, that's going to be a problem. They don't have anything else. There isn't anything else. We don't have an internationally agreed set of data definitions and data. We don't have a public, international public receptacle, if I was to call it that, or repository for data. That remains an interesting issue. It seems to me one thing they did do for part of the reason that Alex pointed out and I mentioned at the beginning is that they made us aware of international comparability. And that's a huge success. It took places out of their insularity.
Thank you both. I will try to integrate two of the next questions. So these two questions are closely interrelated. They come from Laura Crane and from Ryan Allen. And I think both have to do with alternatives to rankings, right? Like, is it possible to move away from them? And if we do, what do we move into in that case? So one way to present this question is there any evidence that of people or institutions turning away from existing rankings, right? I think the argument has been made at times that if people moved away or if there were no rankings, something else would occupy that space. But you both talked about a changing environment, whether the purpose of rankings, whether what is expected from higher education institutions is changing. Is there an alternative? Is there something to turn away or is there not? And perhaps we are kind of stuck with these problematic but influential exercises.
I think it depends if we're talking nationally or internationally. I think nationally there probably are some ways that you can do this. I think internationally, I think we're stuck with ranking with mainly research related methods. If what you want to look at is outputs, right? I mean, maybe, maybe one day, they'll fix a helo to the point where people will look at it. And maybe we can look at some kinds of research of learning outcomes. I know that's a very fraught view and not everybody agrees with it, but I think it's worth continuing to work on that kind of stuff. For the foreseeable future, the only outputs that you're going to look at are related to research. And they might be things like PhD, and they might be things like, if you really want, you can play around with prizes and that kind of stuff. And I think we could do more than we do now to look at the economics of the research. So I'm just thinking in my country, we've got, if I think about the top 6 or 8 universities in Canada, the range of dollars per research for dollars per student to get similar levels of research output, it could be 2 to 1, right? The really rich universities and the slightly poor. That's actually something worth thinking about. Like, there's lessons to be learned from that kind of economic analysis, which I don't think we've really done yet internationally. But yeah, I think that's my view. I think there are more interesting benchmarks and there are interesting more national discussions we can have, but globally, yeah, we're stuck with this, is my view.
Yeah, I think probably, but I'm not quite sure how. I mean, the thing about rankings is, yes, I do. If I saw talking to a government, I'd say, but look, you're aware of it because it shows you shifts, some trends over time, and it's quite interesting looking at that, but never to be slavish. But having said that, I think certainly at national levels, the issues are changing. Here we've got the Tory government in the UK with a levelling up strategy. Now, how sincere are they, whatever, but the strategy is moving because the over-concentration in countries around particular sets of universities which focus on particular sets of cities has left and created huge regional disparities. It's not just simply, it's not a causation. This hasn't happened because of just doing that, but we also see this incredible strategy and how that's worked. So, I did a piece recently, have we left effectively 50% of the population behind? So we talk about, certainly the European strategy is about 40% for university attainment and enrollment by now, actually. But in the Irish case, it's much higher than that. It's about 47%. But the point is what about the other 50%? So the community college, the further education, the other post-secondary community has been poorly served, poorly funded. The institutions that are catering have been less well funded. And we begin to reap those social political problems. And even, as I would say, for the Tories, that's an issue. So, and it's a big issue in the US, obviously, and it's a big issue even in Ireland. So these kinds of issues, I think, are focusing and changing that conversation. And so while you might look at that, it has, you might look at rankings, it has changed that. So what else is out there to look at? So what's entering into it, aside from the fact that we don't have a halo and the pluses and minuses and the debate around why we don't have it, PIAC. So you've got the OECD issue measuring adult skills. And that's showing up really quite interesting information and data. But are there other mechanisms like that? Because people, certainly at a policy level, want to know, it's not a ranking, but they want to know, how are other people doing this and what can we learn from that? So that more sophisticated level of benchmarking, I think, has huge potential if we can distill the information. My concern is that some of the benchmarking will simply end up producing kind of charts and tables that aren't sufficiently meaningful, and then people come away with, again, simplistic understanding.
Thank you both. I think, kind of to stay with this theme of potential alternatives, there are a handful of questions from the chat that deal with these. So there are a few from Bethel, Ukazu, as well as from Robert Hollister and Qian Jia. So the question is, if not a completely different exercise, let's say staying with rankings, maybe are new forms of ranking, global rankings that could provide some alternatives and flexibility. The few of the options discussed in this group of questions include, for example, the German exercise. I believe they're referring to the U multi-rank that tends to be, customizable for the different things that we look at, field by field and so on. But there are two particular questions. Those are the ones by Robert Hollister and Qian Jia, related to the Times Higher Education Impact Ranking. Do you see those as exercises that really are different enough, or are there just some of the trends that you have been commenting on from your remarks?
It's a money-making exercise. Alex alluded to some of the problems on the methodology. The methodological problems are huge, and it is, again, it's a plus and minus. So I say this, which is at the same time is kind of self-criticizing. What I'm going to say is that part of it is based on data depends on what the data you get. So it's voluntary. And that's fine. People put in for it. So the institutions that are putting into it are those that feel, well, right, we can get something out of it. Now that's a good thing. But on the other side, it depends on who's in the pile. So it's not like you're looking at a lot. And I have a lot of ethical questions about what exactly they're doing. U multi-rank is a potential, but it has never caught on. There are difficulties with some of its indicators. Again, it's a voluntary thing. It has about 900 universities fully involved in it, but it's been going since 2012, 2014, and we've only 800 in it. It could be a fantastic mechanism if, let's say, all the European universities were part of it and all in, use it for Europe, and see does it work. But I wonder why we're fixated on talking about rankings. And I just, this idea that one has to be better, rebuilding that, I'm not sure that a ranking is the mechanism we want to be looking at.
I mean, I take it from this point of view, which is simply alternatives to current rankings are incredibly labor intensive to create. And that would be true whether you were doing it as a ranking or not, right? You could be imagined as just being like, put the data into a central data system, what do they call the common data set in the United States, right? You could have all sorts of great new indicators that aren't research based in a common data set. It's insane because nobody collects this stuff now, right? And the contextual stuff that people really want is really hard to measure. Lots of places don't do it. And this was the problem that you multi-rank ran into in 2012 or whatever it was, which is a lot of the really neat stuff they wanted to collect just didn't exist. And when institutions tried to collect it, it was a little bit haphazard. It was tough, right? And it limited take-up. I mean, the second reason is that some universities won't play unless they know they're going to be at the top of the ranking. Right. So when U multi-rank came along, what was the first thing that happened? Almost no American schools played. And that was partly because U multi-rank is European, but none of the leading universities of Europe played. None of the LERU members played either. Why? Because they weren't going to be guaranteed to be at the top. Right. They were quite happy to provide THE with data as long as it was about prestige, but as long as it's about actual output, suddenly these people don't want to play. Times Higher made fun of U multi-rank in 2014 when it first came out. Well, how can you have a ranking that doesn't have the leading research universities of Europe? And then they brought a THE, and not a single member of the leading European research universities group participated. And Phil Beatty's never actually apologized to U multi-rank for his nasty little comments 5 years earlier, but that would be useful. But they learned the same lesson, right? Which is you can't compel data that institutions don't already collect. You can't compel them to give it to anybody. I mean, governments could, but then again, governments are not going to get together for the purpose of university ranking. It just doesn't work that way. So I don't think it's a solvable problem, to be honest with you. I just think, that there's a certain amount of gamesmanship that is inherent in ranking from institutions' point of view. They want to be able to game this stuff to some degree. And like I said, I mean, I salute Times Higher Education for trying something different with the impact rankings. I really do. I think they were a useful step forward, but they weren't a huge step forward because necessarily because of those problems with data, you have to bring in all sorts of weird solutions to how So I mean, the thing about Times Higher Education, what is there's 17 SDGs, but you only have to submit data on 3 of them.
No, you have the 17th as well.
Oh, that's right. So there's one is common, and then another then you could do as many more. Well, who knows? I mean, how do you get a ranking when it's that unbalanced, which you're doing?
27% of each indicator is research, and the rest of it is whatever you're having, whatever you're.
Yeah, that's right. And the research stuff is not terrible, Ellen, I don't think, because I think the idea that universities are doing research on topics that matter to global sustainable development, that's a useful as opposed to how do I make family transitions in family generational transitions in family, large billion-dollar family firms, right? I mean, that's a big topic in business. Who cares, right? I mean, it is so I kind of like that use of research. It's not perfect, but I kind of like the intent behind it. But the only third-party data out there is research data. And as soon as you get into collecting data from institutions, they have a veto and they have the ability to game the data a bit. And there's not much you can do about it. So pick your poison.
Yeah. And it's very difficult to, as much as we'd like to look at institutional-based data as from the source, it's very difficult to get a reality authenticity about it.
And to standardize it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's impossible. And there is no agreement on, and even within countries, in some cases, I mean, I think Germany was an example I had looked at before, where even definitions of what are postgraduate students and so on, these things vary so considerably, which is why even the staff-student ratio, which is widely used, is such a completely meaningless indicator, and yet people insist on using it And when you challenge people and say, no, this is actually not very meaningful, they tell you, oh yes, this tells us something. It's not. It's a ruse to try and get more staff or cut down on staff or something. Someone asked about Carnegie Classifications. Are these, I mean, these are all different ways to look at it. You could look at issues around, quote, ratings. So QS has its rating system. Of course, you have to pay into it. But aside from that, if there was a kind of a ratings, a bit like you're an, I don't, again, there's a hierarchy, but is there a way in which we could begin to get institutions to look at their own mission? It's very difficult, and even, but that would seem to me to be a way to go. I think we're going to increasingly get governments looking at a wider set of issues. And this comes off the back also of funding and funding models, and how that's going to interplay with universities.
And that STARS ranking is not that far off what some national accreditors do, right? I'm thinking of Chile. Chile has a ranked accreditation system, right? You get ranked for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. And it's the weirdest thing. You take public transport in Santiago and you keep seeing like Liz, I've never seen so much advertising for higher education in my life. And it's really prominent on the advertising. We are accredited for 5 years, or we are accredited for 7 years. And that's the goal. 7, I think, is the gold standard there. And that's not largely based on outcomes. That's largely saying, well, what kind of institution are you? What kind of processes do you have? What are the standards for hiring? What are the standards for tenure? I'm not sure if they actually have tenure there, but you know what I mean? It is a little bit more process based. Malaysia tried something like that about 10, 12 years ago. They had something called the Satara Ranking, where they came up with like a 1 to 6 stars, all based off accreditation data and interviews. And the accreditation agency hated it. They were told to do it, but they hated doing it. So I could see those kinds of things happening, probably regionally, but not global. Like you could see the European Union coming up with something like that, but it would be you couldn't imagine it being a global ranking. I think that would.
But even the EU in terms of looking at you multi-rank, and it was all a very good idea. It came from the French at the Paris conference in 2007, and it was a good idea. The problem is some of the ingenuity around it had already been passed by, the interoperability, the use of choice and so on. It just took them too long, and people then didn't buy into it. So I guess I'm of increasingly maybe of a view of just let them there, and things have a sell-by date and they fall over, and times move on and push. Other things come to the fore, and I think that's largely where we are, certainly in parts of the country, in the parts of the world. You mentioned, Alex, that some parts of the world, the rankings still remain important. They do. It was in the time when we were always looking at bricks. It's very difficult to be a brick and not be at least ranked. So how do you do that? You can't, I mean, they're kind of contradictory kind of terms. But by and large, I think even those issues are beginning, because this debate on what is the role of higher education is moving on. And that is a big conversation.
Well, this is obviously the point where we are just about to hit the hour. So before I pose the final question for both our presenters, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I do also want to invite you to our next webinar in February. It will be at the same time, also on a Tuesday. It will be on February 16th, and it will be focused on the work that the World Bank is doing on higher education. Our presenters for that webinar will be Roberta Malii-Bassett and Jamil Salmi. So the final question for our presenters today, it's again with an apology, since we couldn't get to all of the many intriguing questions that were presented. It has to do with community engagement. There were quite a few questions related to, of course, the Carnegie Classification, and a few comments reminding us that Carnegie has included an elective classification for community engagement. could something of the sort, right, looking perhaps at the public good of the university be something to pay more attention to? What would be the opportunities and perhaps the obstacles for pursuing something like that?
Well, certainly that is one of the hot topics on both the policy and institutional agenda. And yes, you've got the Carnegie classification looking at engagement, and you have a lot of other types of mechanisms. One of the real difficulties is how you scale that and definitions around what it is. And that's really this impact public value, which is a huge discussion. I mean, I'm involved in a lot of them, but and there's a lot of initiatives coming out about it. I mean, they're all over it. Even the definition of what we're talking about varies. The terminology around it varies. So there's a way to go on where it is. A lot of it is qualitative that's come in. And so picking those indicators is really, because that's essentially what you need to do when you're looking at these kinds of mechanisms. You're reducing big ideas to simple indicators, and it's really quite complicated as to what you're collecting. Before I finish, can I give a plug for the book coming out? Georgiana, I think, is on this webinar somewhere. So Georgiana Mihu and myself are co-editing the research handbook on university rankings, history, methodology, influence, and impact. Many of our authors are here, including Alex and Phil and Hans and Gerardo and Laura, and so a whole CIHE group and others, and indeed Alex himself. So coming to a bookshop near you in recognition of 20 years of global rankings. So I'll pass over my advertisement to Alex.
Yeah, and I'll advertise a couple other people. I mean, I think there's two pieces of work that I've read lately, and it's actually the topic of my Monday blog next week, are efforts to look at community engagement and how to measure it and how to, and how you address them through external communities, those kinds of things. I think in Europe, one of the things is CHEPS has been doing something called the Towards a European Framework for Community Engagement in Higher Education, TEFC.
Yeah, I'm involved in that project. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I think there's interesting ideas going on within that. That's less about measuring and more about, there's a certain degree of classification involved, which I think is certainly interesting. And Julie Wells at the University of Melbourne has been leading a project on measuring engagement. And she's just put out, it was a few weeks ago, it's called Advancing University Engagement, University Engagement and Global League Tables. And that's Julie Wells, Jonathan Grant, Derek Douglas. So that's Melbourne, London, Chicago. And it's an interesting little report, which is on the University of Melbourne website. And I think if you're interested in these issues, it's probably worth a look.
Well, thank you, Alex and Ellen, for joining us and for sharing your ideas. I think I don't even need to remind everybody of how engaging this has been, since we could get only to a very small portion of the questions. We hope we can rely on you for doing a follow-up in the near future, since this topic has many other aspects to be discussed. Thank you again, and thank you all for joining us in our very first webinar of the year. We look forward to continuing to engage with all of you. And as always, we invite you to follow our different publications in the center and to stay in touch with all of us. Thank you and take care.
Thanks very much. Bye.